Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the third part in our CCUS Demystified series, CO2 storage and EOR, safe and sound underground. My name is Alex Krauka. I'm a Deputy Program Director here at the U.S. Energy Association on our consensus program, which I'll discuss in just a moment. For anyone who is not familiar with USEA, we are a nonprofit, non-lobbying educational association founded in 1924 that represents kind of the full gamut of the energy industry, whether it's fossils, renewables, nuclear, everything in between. We work to support the industry by increasing the understanding of energy issues, both domestically and internationally. And we serve as a resource, convening energy stakeholders to share policy, scientific, and technological information to foster the advancement of the entire energy sector. As I mentioned, I'm a Deputy Program Director for our Consensus program, which seeks to build both a domestic and international consensus on the needs for and uses of various clean fossil energy technologies, such as CCUS, clean coal technologies, hydrogen with CCUS, and others. We do this work convening briefings, webinars such as today's, as well as workshops around the country and sometimes internationally as well. We produce research reports and white papers, which you'll be able to find on our website. And then we also have a bi-monthly newsletter to keep our stakeholders informed. Just a couple logistical items to go over. This webinar is being recorded. We plan to post the recording of the webinar on our event page as well as on YouTube. Please give us a couple days to accomplish this. We have an annual event tomorrow, so it may not be until Friday. However, once it's posted, we will let everyone know. With regards to Q&A, we're going to hold off on Q&A until after all of the presentations, but please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window for any questions and comments that you may have. And for those folks who plan to utilize this webinar for any continuing education units or professional development, please feel free to contact me if you require a certificate of attendance or participation to do so. We've got a great set of speakers today. And before we go into the speakers, just a couple of terms to know for those folks who are new to CCUS. CCUS, known as carbon capture, use, and storage, or maybe more technically, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, entails capturing CO2 emissions from power generation and industrial sources, things such as cement production, steel manufacturing, ethanol production, and then either using that CO2 or storing it safely and securely underground. So when we're talking about geologic storage, that means the permanent storage of CO2 in deep underground formations. Sometimes folks kind of imagine that, the CO2 will be stored, 15 feet underground in your backyard, and no, it's thousands of feet under the surface, and Sue Havorka will give us some more details on that and really how deep these underground formations are. You may hear you will hear mention of class 2 and class 6 wells. Those are EPA designation for CO2 injection wells that are used for EOR and storage. Speaking of EOR, we're referring to enhanced oil recovery, a technique where CO2 is injected into depleted oil fields to extract additional oil. And then the final question that we hope to address in this series is, why CCUS? Why is this important? On one hand, it's an opportunity for economic development activities, whether that's additional construction, the emergence of new industries utilizing CO2, whether that's in, like I said, cement manufacturing or other building materials manufacturing. I've even heard of vodkas being made with CO2. So enhanced oil recovery is generally the big CO2 utilization method, but there are a lot of kind of niche and upcoming technologies that utilize CO2 in other ways as well. So I think we want to bolster those industry efforts at innovating. Additionally, it makes products that are made in America more marketable in certain areas of the world that may have CO2 requirements or caps on their projects. So it is a way for the oil and gas industry to market their products abroad as well. And then obviously there are environmental benefits, namely from the climate. The IPCC report has named CCUS as one of the keys to meeting climate goals for those who find that important to them. And there are also certain instances where CCUS can reduce other pollutants from various industrial sources. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to the real experts speaking on this. Our speakers today are Dr. Sue Hovorka from UT Austin's Bureau of Economic Geology, Matt Wallace, Vice President at ARI, and then Molly McAvoy, who's in the Underground Injection Control branch of the US EPA. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Sue. And thank you for joining us, Sue. I'm going to stop sharing, so you should be able to share.
I'm getting ready to share here. And of course, it made everything jump around. There we go. All right, I got the right one?
Yes, you do, and we can hear you, so you're good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to give the basics of CO2 storage, and I'm going to try to keep it relatively simple. I do work on serious research, so ask me hard questions as you wish. But I'm going to try to do my best to talk in non-technical language. Which is, so we heard a little bit about why. Most basically, if you take carbon, and all of us are taking carbon in our cars, in cement, for light, for energy, for electricity, for many chemical products, and we're releasing CO2 at this present time, mostly releasing it to the atmosphere. And you're taking it out of storage, out of permanent storage in the earth where it's been stored as oil or gas or coal or limestone. You're taking it out of this storage and putting it in the atmosphere. If you don't want to do that, put it back. And carbon capture and storage with or without use is the way of putting it back. I'm going to focus a little bit on the putting it back for the purpose of putting it back. And Matt will talk about the use aspect. So I've done a lot of work also on use, but he's going to talk about that, take you through that aspect. To start that off, we can either put it back where we got it in a oil or gas reservoir, which has various benefits, including use to produce more oil, or we can put it back in an environment that's like the environment that it came out of, but not identical, which has an advantage of being possible where there's no oil and gas activities. And maybe it has an advantage of having to deal with fewer legacy wells, which we can deal with, but there are several advantages to both approaches. So how exactly does putting it back work? I'll give you a little bit of information. The first thing, as we heard, was that it's got to go deep. We can't put it shallow for several reasons. Molly will tell you that our federal rules, which are 50 years old, forbid putting it back where it could damage freshwater resources. So it's got to be below, and we've got to show that it's separated, that freshwater resources are protected. So it's got to be deep because it's got to be below freshwater. Whereas the freshwater, it depends on where you live. If you live in flat areas, the freshwater maybe goes 500 feet deep. If you live in mountainous areas or areas that are connected to mountainous areas, or even where I live in Texas, there it can be the freshwater can go several thousand feet deep. So it's got to be below that. The second thing of putting it deep is that it's much more efficient. It sounds counterintuitive. Why would we want to go deep? But we want to go deep because as the CO2 goes deeper, it gets compressed. CO2 is a non-ideal gas, so it becomes liquid-like at a depth of about half a mile below the surface. It becomes more compressed and takes up less space, and so is more efficient to store. So it's worth drilling an extra bit to get that efficiency of storage, and it's required by our regulations. So it's deep. It's not that depth itself is quite protective. People say, why don't you just engineer something like a cement thing and put the CO2 in that? And you realize that a mile of earth materials is actually much more secure than anything we could engineer in a tank. It's really good stuff. Let me talk a little more about that, why earth materials are so good a container. It's in layers. The layered sedimentary rocks, that mile is made of many types of sedimentary rocks because the seas went in, the seas went out. So some of them, these rocks, allow fluid flow. Of course, the zone that we inject into has to allow fluid flow, has to allow something to go into it. Sometimes people say, well, what do you do when you fill up the well? And you have to realize that this is the inverse of getting water out of an aquifer or getting oil or gas out of a reservoir. You're putting it into something that can transmit fluid. So it's something that allows flow. I'll show you a little more about allowing flow. Also, other zones allow flow. So if we worry about the security, that this is not a process, we're trying to get the permanence of that we have for fossil fuel, coal and oil and gas are still stored very permanently. We want to restore that permanence of storage. We want it out of the atmosphere permanently. And so it means that those layers is defense in depth. So we also have layers that forbid flow. We call this impermeable, not permeable. And these are made of the same sorts of materials, clay materials, for example, that you use for making plates. So imagine these, if you're not sure what kind of materials these are, imagine that it's like a dinner plate down there. It's holding things down quite firmly. And now, so then the dinner plate could crack. We'll talk about that shortly. But this defense in depth, if there's one of these, a dinner plate that has a crack, or we have a stack of plates. This is the fact that it's a stack of sediments between the injection zone and the fresh water provides very strong evidence. We call this composite confining. The lowest zone is often referred to as the confining zone. That's what the regulations require, that we approve a confining zone. And the composite of many of them provides very secure storage against any situation. The other thing that provides very secure storage is that the storage is occurring in millimeter diameter holes, which we refer to as pores. So you see here a CT scan of a rock. It's a thumb-sized piece of rock blown up a bit. And the yellow material that you see is the holes. And we've simulated flow through those holes. It can accept fluids. Sometimes people talk about sponges. I'm going to give you another example, even more commonplace than a sponge, about retaining the fluids. The physics of flow in these small spaces is important because one, it's possible. Things go through small holes. And second, it retains fluids. They can't get out. Here's a case. This sounds really simple, but You could try it at home. My shirt is made of porous material. If you want to test it, you could look through your shirt for see if you see the little holes. You can hold them up against a window, you see tiny holes. That's about the scale of holes we're talking about in the rocks of the subsurface, the pores. And if we spill something on your shirt, which you've had experience of, I spilled, now what happens? If you spill on something that's not permeable, like you spill on a raincoat or a table, then that's what you're worried about, something that you, CO2 running off the edge of the table and going where we don't want it, where it's not acceptable. But if we put it in something that's full of small holes, then it gets stuck in between. So we blow up that, we put a magnifying glass and we look at the shirt and we see those fibers that make up the shirt and in the rock, there are the spaces between the sand grains, and the material that's gets stuck between them. When you spill on your shirt, it can go a little way, but it can't go off the edge of the table. That's why we use placemats and do laundry. It's because things in porous media don't travel very far. It's pretty secure because and if you want the technical name, it's stuck by capillary forces. It's called non-wetting residual saturation and two-phase flow field. That's the technical name. It's very well known. Matt's smiling because that's what he's going to try to overcome to get the hydrocarbons back out of the ground. It gets stuck down there, and for storage in any setting, that's to our advantage that it can't get through layers of this. It's like a whole pile of diapers. It has layers of plastic that provide barriers, but also layers that are absorbent that provide retention. Diapers are porous media too. That's why they work. So let me give you an example to make sure that you understand this. This is my CO2 that we injected in 2004. I guess it was really your CO2 because this was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy as one of the first experiments in the world, one of the first experiments in the U.S. We injected it 550 feet underground outside of Houston. And you're seeing a bunch of technical data. We injected in a place that we wanted to know about this. Would it act like spilling on a raincoat and run out? Or would it act as spilling on a placemat and stay stuck? Scientists argue about this. So we picked a place that we could test it. The rocks are tilted, so they're about 15 degrees so that it will run if it's going to, and they're very permeable. The technical measure is it's a Darcy, quite permeable. So the fluids will run if they can run. And so did they run? They did run. We calculated how far we thought they would go, and they did go a distance of 100 feet, and we modeled it. So would they keep running and just leave? All right, let's find out. We go back a year later to see if they've run away. What do you think? All right, this is called a vertical seismic profile. It's a measurement. The bright things are showing where we're seeing a change in the velocity of sound. It's basically a sonogram of the Earth, and the thing we're imaging is where our CO2 is. So this is where we put the little bit of CO2 in 2004. Has it left? Let's look. Nope, still there. All right, it's still there. We can measure it with a number of different instruments. We did. It's still there. It didn't run away. All right, can it come back out at us? All right, here we are. This is Yusuf Karaka from U.S. Geological Survey, and a very young Tommy Phelps, for those of you who know. No, not Tommy. Who's that? Anyway, looking, and they're trying to get it back out. And so the guys who were running this for us said, we set up all the equipment, including a flare in case something came out. We set up our measuring equipment and we started swabbing, pumping a little bit. And around about a couple hours later, the chief of the guy who's running the operations came to me and said, "Hey, lady, this well ain't no good." And I said, "Keep swabbing. That's what we want to show, that this is not a good well." He thought we were nuts, but this is something that you guys wanted to know. Once it's down there, how do we know it's going to stay put? And this is some of the evidence. It does. It did. It does. It will. It makes sense. Theoretically, we see it in the field. We can replicate it. We can prove it. We do it again and again because it's a key parameter. So where can this happen? Where do we have permeable rocks at depths that are sufficient to make it dense phase to get it below fresh water? The blue areas are very strong. The light blue areas are maybe whether or not there's isolation, sufficient isolation has to be proven. So some of those areas in the Midwest are a problem. We may not be able to isolate inject at great depth. One of the things we want to do research in is how we could get options. I could talk about that. So there's about half the U.S. is candidate. There are some areas you see in the tan colors that are not viable. So there are winners and losers in this about who can do CCS or CCUS. There's more about this on the citation if you want to read about exactly what we did, how we did, and how it works in the whole system. A lot of people want to know about risk and risk mitigation. We do as researchers. That's one of the things I do personally. Let me give you just a couple key points that Molly can talk about the permitting process. We know because we've been deep well injecting for about 100 years, large volumes of different fluids, mostly brine, but also all kinds of other fluids like from meat packing plants and some of it quite dangerous fluids. So we have 100 years, about 50 years under the regulation of the underground injection control program. So we have a lot of information. And CO2 is special stuff, but it's not that special. We are alert to the differences of CO2, but they're not huge. All the experience of 100 years experience. So people say, this is a new thing. How do you know it's safe? Say, yeah, this is built on to 100 years. We also have 100 years, 50 years of injection for CO2 and enhanced oil recovery, which Matt could talk about. So the major failure that we know about from past is existing wells that fail to perform correctly. So I'll show you a little bit about that. You must have also heard about induced seismicity has happened. It's happened here and there, but not most places. My inventory, you hear about in the news, the places where it's happened. You don't hear about it in the news as the places where it doesn't happen, which is most of the places. So let me show you that. I'm not going to talk about worrying about pipelines. I also won't talk about the well-known danger of CO2 in confined space. It's confined space risk if you have CO2 and no ventilation. That's the problem. Not CO2 itself, but CO2 without ventilation, which is really important for management and safety. That a fan will fix it. Let me talk about wells. So wells are constructed to isolate the deep subsurface from the water in the surface. Originally, they're isolated because you didn't want to pull surface water down when you're pumping to get hydrocarbons out. And then they're protected because we realized that early in the development of oil and gas industry that the saline fluids were a hazard to fresh water into the surface too. So they're required to be isolating, and this is how we do it. We bring out a rig, we drill through it, the fresh water, and then we cement that in with the casing and cement and show the regulator that the fresh water is protected. I know because I've done it. They ask hard questions and want to see that this is correct. Second thing, we take a smaller bit and we go down deeper to drill deep. You could do this in stages. I've done it one stage, and you have to cement that off, and you have to prove that cement is isolating. So wells are supposed to be isolating, and that means that they're supposed to, if you decide to reverse the process and deep well inject, they should be isolating for that. Do we believe everything we have in the? No, we do not. There could be things that went wrong, wells that got old, wells that were damaged during operation, wells that were not reported correctly. So it's a requirement to get a permit to deep well inject. And Molly can talk about this, is a requirement to show that this construction is in place. And if not, make sure it's in place for every well that is involved in the project. And that's a lot of the work we're doing now, is to figure out how many wells need to be found, how many wells need to be proven, what the efficient way to prove them up. We know we can prove it's been done many times. How do we do it efficiently? What's the very best practice to make this efficient and complete? So here's a case. We in Texas deal with this a lot. All that's dots are legacy wells. Look at them all. So this is not a fresh new idea for us. Notice though, they're concentrated where the hydrocarbons are. Those blue areas are the dark blue areas where the are where the hydrocarbons are, and the light blue areas are everything that went into that. So we want to find areas that, so we made a choose, and Matt will talk to you about developing those areas where there are lots of legacy wells, which we can do and have been doing since the 70s. But if we want to do saline injection, avoid the wells, we can find areas that don't have very many. And that's where a lot of the projects that are being selected now are being selected where there are sparse wells. Few wells need to be fixed. That means that there's an efficiency because you have few wells to deal with. You could do a double check. So the permitting is the first check. Every operator has to show that all these wells have been found and how they're completed and that they are in fact isolating. And if not, they have to do what's called a remedial action, fix them. And then we could have monitoring as a double check. I'm very interested in this. This is only one of our monitoring techniques where we use the air mattress method. If this air mattress got a leak, you'll find out it's hissing and it's not keeping the pressure up in one zone. So we measure this pressure above zone. If the two zones are connected together, say, oops, there's a well leaking. Now, this is not an immediate tragedy, but it means something has to be found and fixed. Because you don't have permission, you haven't showed that shallower zone is isolating. So you have to get in there and fix it. You could fix wells. It's not free. It's expensive, but it's possible and it has to be done if you want to use it. Second problem I said I would talk about is seismicity, meaning earthquakes. And this has happened. We've known about it since the 70s, that deep well injection near Denver caused seismic events. Other places that we've injected water, these are mostly water that's extracted along with hydrocarbons in the Permian Basin. Now the Permian Basin is a very busy place. They've had a lot of recent increase in production and a very high water disposal needs related to that production. So these are my colleagues, Peter Hennings, Katie Smy, doing a elaborate study that I'm not going to explain in detail. But these are difficult rocks, and they have had seismicity, and we work on them. The key thing I want to communicate is either you can avoid this problem or manage this problem. It's not intractable. And it's not necessary everywhere. It's part of our management. It's required to get a permit so that you know that what you're doing to avoid or managing seismicity, and it's tractable. Places where management has been brought in have been effective in reducing seismic events. I could talk more about seismicity, but it gets technical, so I'm going to stop. And tell you if you want more public information, easy to read information, our accessible website that's got friendly information is putitback.org. I give out stickers. Put it back. If you need a sticker, let me know. And we also have more technical information if you want it. My email address is there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. Really appreciate you joining us for this and providing a good simple overview for folks who are not as technical, folks such as myself. So really appreciate you taking the time to do that. Next up, we have ARI's Matt Wallace, who's going to discuss the U in CCUS, particularly enhanced oil recovery. ARI, or Matt and his team at ARI, have extensive experience in the topic. So, Matt, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Sue, for setup. Let's go ahead and share here. Yeah, but again, my name is Matt Wallace. I'm a vice president with Advanced Resources International. I've been working with CO2 EOR for about the last 15 years now, and excited for the opportunity to provide some kind of basic background and then maybe a little bit more technical understanding of what the process is and how it fits in the CO2 storage landscape. First, just some fundamentals. You may or may not have seen this kind of diagram. CO2 enhanced oil recovery is, very simply the process of injecting supercritical CO2 into a depleted oil reservoir for the purpose of producing incremental oil from that reservoir that otherwise would not be produced. It's a non-producible, non-economic reservoir. So you're using CO2 to extend the life of that oil field and produce a little bit more oil from the reservoir. As Sue pointed out, CO2 EOR actually has a depth limit due to the miscibility and the conditions of the CO2 that you inject into the reservoir. Very roughly about 3,000 feet deep is required for what we call miscible CO2, where CO2 can mix with the oil. That's not fully the case. There are some shallower settings where that's possible, and there's also immiscible CO2 that can help drive heavier oils or help displace residual oil without full miscibility. But overall, CO2 EOR is a tertiary recovery process, and it does extend the life of existing fields and is generally used in oil fields that have already been developed. There are some cases where CO2 EOR could apply for oil fields that have not yet been drilled. We talk a lot about residual oil zones in the Permian Basin and elsewhere. But by and large, what we're talking about is taking CO2 into an existing oil field to produce additional oil. And one question that we get a lot, just to address, is that while you do produce a lot of the CO2 that you inject for EOR, especially up front in the first few years of injection, that CO2 is produced along with the oil and is contained in the closed system of the EOR project. It's produced and recycled, it's reconditioned and dehydrated and re-injected into the field for CO2 EOR again. So those molecules of CO2 may have several trips around the injection cycle, but ultimately all of the CO2 that you purchase, and I use the word purchase as in all of the CO2 that is brought into the EOR system for a field, ultimately is securely stored underground. You're not producing the CO2 after you inject it and venting it. Up until very recently, CO2 was a very expensive commodity. So operators were very good at accounting for their CO2 and making sure that there were no leaks and no CO2 was getting outside of the system. So just to address that, all of your CO2 that you inject ultimately is stored as part of the EOR process. So what has EOR done in the US to date? I like this slide because it kind of sums up the history of CO2 EOR over the last, in this case, 38 years, just when records started to be kept. But CO2 EOR has over 50-year history in the US. We've stored about 390 million tons of anthropogenic CO2. And that is strictly CO2 from anthropogenic sources like CO2 from gas processing or ammonia plants or ethanol plants. In total, we have stored 1.5 billion metric tons of CO2. The rest of that CO2 coming from natural sources, mainly in Colorado and the West. But CO2 EOR is a very efficient, a very good way to store CO2 geologically. We've produced about 3 billion barrels of incremental oil from CO2 EOR over this time. This is all oil that otherwise would not have been produced from fields that were extended by the use of CO2 EOR. And so overall, we're storing about 10 million tons of anthropogenic CO2 each year with CO2 EOR, and we've been doing that for the last 30 years on average. So again, a great demonstration and great way to securely store CO2 geologically. Where is this all happening? This is a quick overview of the US and encompassing all of the CO2 EOR activity in the US right now. This is as of 2024, but we have a total of 140 different projects that produce in total about 220,000 barrels per day. I'm showing here all of the sources of CO2, as well as the CO2 pipeline infrastructure and the CO2 EOR field locations. Most of this is happening in the Permian Basin. About 70% of the total oil produced with CO2 EOR comes from the Permian. We also have operations in the Gulf Coast and the Mid-Continent, and then Wyoming, which has a very extensive CO2 pipeline network running all the way across the state. And then lastly, we are producing CO2 EOR up in Michigan, with some interesting geologic formations up there. But if you know anything about the geology and the sedimentary basins in the US, you know that all of these areas are different, and CO2 EOR is happening in a pretty varied reservoir locations. Total supply for CO2 EOR as of 2024, about 2 BCF per day, which is about 38 million metric tons of CO2 per year that is supplied for CO2 EOR. This is what we call purchased CO2. So all of the CO2, again, will ultimately be stored underground in the oil reservoirs. We're showing, and I'll point out here, all of our anthropogenic sources, including gas processing facilities in Wyoming, ethanol and nitrogen fertilizer plants in the Mid-Continent in Oklahoma and Kansas, and then more gas processing down in the Permian. These Val Verde gas plants provide about 25 million cubic feet per day of CO2, and they've been running and providing that CO2 since the very beginning, about the last 50 years. Over in the Gulf Coast, we have hydrogen and nitrogen providing CO2, as well as the Petronova, which is our only power plant that captures CO2 and provides CO2 for EOR down at the West Ranch fields in Southeast Texas. A quick snapshot of CO2 pipeline infrastructure. I know some of this has been covered in previous sessions with USEA, so I won't go too in depth, but just relatively, CO2 transportation pipelines we have around 5,000 miles total in the US. There's some in North Dakota that go to Canada, as well as the rest of the infrastructure seen here. But all told, it's pretty minimal compared to the rest of the pipeline transportation system in the US. About 600,000 miles of both gas transmission and liquids pipeline transportation infrastructure in the US, as we can see here. So, relatively small volume transporting CO2. I think this is an important topic to discuss here in terms of the technical potential that CO2 EOR provides in terms of reduced carbon intensity for the oil that we use every day. I think some folks will argue that CO2 EOR may prolong oil dependence, but I think we can all agree that oil and gas are very important to our functions, and we need it. We have a non-zero demand for oil in the US, and I think while that is the case, it would be good to examine the possibility for how CO2 EOR can contribute to the oil that we use in terms of reducing the carbon intensity of that oil and the low carbon fuel products that would come from it. So I'm showing here just historically the numbers of CO2 utilization for EOR. And what I mean by that is how many cubic feet or tons of CO2 do we put into the ground to produce the barrels of oil that come from it. So historically we've varied, and this depends on market and other things, but we have an average of maybe over 9,000 cubic feet of CO2 per barrel that we utilize to produce CO2 EOR oil. I think we're at an important time to do a lot of work on this subject and do some more focused life cycle assessment studies on the CO2 emissions associated with CO2 EOR. But a rough estimate of the CO2 content of a barrel of conventional oil that we produce in the U.S., given the associated production activity, transportation, refining, and then the consumption of that barrel of oil is around 8.6 MCF per barrel. Comparing that to CO2 EOR and the utilization that we get from storing CO2 to produce oil, I'm not going to get into specifics, but I think we can see that CO2 EOR provides a significant reduction in that carbon intensity for oil production. So again, a lot of work to do here, but that's one of the key benefits of CO2 EOR in terms of why it's important to store CO2 with our oil production. And then, another topic that's really important right now, getting a lot of discussion, is energy security in the U.S. And I like this slide because I'm showing the number of projects by year that have come on and are still active as of 2024. So some of the earliest projects that started in the early 70s are still active and still producing, a significant volume of oil, 15,000 barrels per day from some projects from the early 70s. So here we're really just showing the investment in CO2 EOR is significant and provides a great return on your investment for producing oil with CO2 enhanced oil recovery. Close to 90% of the oil produced last year came from projects that started over 15 years ago. So given that CO2 EOR can produce another 15% of the oil from oil fields that are essentially depleted and not usable anymore, that shows that there's great potential for CO2 EOR development and using CO2 EOR in existing fields without the need for additional greenfield exploration and development. Lastly, I want to show and kind of line up some of the EOR potential in the U.S. and a very small subset, I think, at this point, of potential CO2 capture. And I've identified here about 70 projects that were at one point announced for CO2 capture. The status of CO2 capture projects changes, almost daily. So this is just a snapshot of some industrial power and direct air capture projects that were announced to the tune of about 130 million tons of CO2 capture and storage a year. I'm overlaying that on top of, again, a subset of the CO2 EOR potential in the U.S. These green dots here are about 1,300 oil reservoirs that have technical capability for CO2 EOR, as in they meet the technical criteria for CO2 miscibility based on the oil reservoir size and depth and things like that. So using some kind of rules of thumb and some assumptions, we essentially have 275 billion barrels of original oil in place for these reservoirs that are amenable for CO2 EOR. And technically what that could mean is an additional 40 billion barrels of incremental recovery from these fields using CO2 EOR, which would store again, very roughly, and using some rules of thumb, about 20 billion metric tons of CO2 storage potential in these fields. So, all of this really just to highlight that CO2 EOR is a proven and a very significant industry that has a lot of potential for CO2 storage and utilization going forward. So I think that's it for me. Thanks again for the opportunity. Look forward to addressing any questions later on, but turn it over to Alex.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. This topic is incredibly important to move CO2 from a waste stream to a commodity. It, as you mentioned, has a lot of potential. I think in a world with 7 billion people, there are billions of people who would like to get to the lifestyle that the 330 million or so of us in the United States would like to have, and I think it's sometimes a little hard to imagine that development happening without oil or without gas. So using technologies such as EOR to reduce the carbon intensity of that, I think is incredibly important. And as I mentioned before, it makes those products that we produce here in the U.S. More marketable internationally as well. So thank you for providing us with this valuable information. And yeah, thank you for taking the time. With that, we're going to pass it over to Molly McAvoy with the EPA to discuss kind of the rules and regulations that we have in place to ensure that these processes are safe. And with that, Molly, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Alex. I will work to share my screen here. Okay, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are.
Great. Okay, so again, my name is Molly McAvoy. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm an engineer and scientist with the Underground Injection Control Program, or the UIC program, within the Office of Water at EPA's headquarters office in Washington, D.C. I've been working with the UIC regulations and CCUS topics for the past 7 years now, and it's been exciting to see, even in that short time, how the industry has evolved. So again, I'm here to speak to EPA's regulations of UIC wells. But before we get into more detail on the types of wells and how those are regulated, first wanted to provide some context around our program and where EPA gets its authority to regulate this activity. So EPA's authority over the UIC program comes from the Safe Drinking Water Act, also known as the CIDWA, which was passed by the United States Congress in 1974. It protects public health by regulating the nation's public drinking water supplies, including both surface and groundwater sources. That directed the agency to develop a program that would protect underground sources of drinking water from injection practices. And EPA subsequently developed the UIC program regulations, which regulates the injection of fluids such as water, wastewater, brines from oil and gas production, and CO2 into the subsurface for the purpose of storage or disposal. The main goal of the UIC program is to protect underground sources of drinking water, or USDWs, as I have them on these slides. And those are aquifers or parts of aquifers that supply water to the public or may do so in the future. The CIDWA also provided a process by which states, tribes, and territories could be approved by the EPA to implement a UIC program. And I'll touch on that in a bit more in a few slides. Where states do not have primacy, the EPA region for that location would be responsible for issuing permit decisions for UIC wells. The UIC program regulates various aspects of an injection well throughout the lifetime of a project. So starting from site evaluation all the way to site closure. The program oversees permitting and site inspections, as well as reporting that is required after the permit is issued, and ensures that operators are in compliance with the UIC regulations. In total, there are 6 well classes regulated under the UIC program for the injection of various types of fluids, and those are shown here on this slide. I'll briefly talk about those that are not related to our topic today, just so to set the stage, but then we'll dive into Class 2 and Class 6 a bit more. So Class 1 wells are used for injecting non-hazardous and hazardous waste. There's approximately 800 of those operating within the United States. Class 2 are UIC injection wells related to oil and gas activities. So these include enhanced recovery wells, which we've talked about today, as well as hydrocarbon storage wells and disposal wells associated with oil and gas activities. Class 3 wells are used to inject fluids to dissolve and extract minerals, so solution mining, such as uranium, copper, and salt mining. And there's about 295 mining sites with approximately 25,000 Class 3 wells operating across the nation. Class 4 are shallow, hazardous, and radioactive injection wells. These may only operate as part of an EPA or state authorized groundwater cleanup action, and they're otherwise banned. There's less than 32 waste cleanup sites with Class 4 wells in the US. And Class 5 wells are used to inject non-hazardous fluids underground. Class 5 is sort of a catch-all for things that injection activities that would not fall neatly within the other well classes. That's a good way to think about Class 5. EPA estimates there are more than 650,000 Class 5 wells operating nationwide. Most Class 5 wells are used to dispose of waste into or above underground sources of drinking water, and many are unsophisticated shallow disposal systems. Examples of these would be stormwater drainage wells, septic system leach fields, and agricultural drainage wells. These also include more sophisticated well types that are deeper, such as aquifer storage and recovery, for example. And then finally, Class 6 wells. This is our newest well class in the EPA UIC program. The rule for this well class took effect in 2011, and these wells are used for geologic sequestration of CO2. So getting into geologic sequestration Class 6 wells. So by definition, Class 6 wells are used to inject CO2 into deep rock formations for the purpose of geologic sequestration. And as we've discussed, these wells are often proposed as part of larger carbon capture and storage projects. A UIC Class 6 permit is required to operate geologic sequestration wells in the US. EPA has issued permits for 18 Class 6 wells. 14 of those permits are currently active, meaning the permits 4 of those 18 have expired. So the 14 remaining are active. They have not expired, or the injection sites have not closed yet. Class 6 regulations were designed to cover a GS project from start to finish, including project siting, permitting, well construction, operation, which includes testing and monitoring and reporting, all the way through injection and post-injection monitoring to site closure. And requirements for Class 6 wells were developed specifically to address the unique risks associated with geologic sequestration. So some of those unique risks, the CO2's buoyancy when injected into the subsurface, for example, and also the large subsurface plumes that are anticipated with these types of projects. The USC Class 6 regulations, they include multiple safeguards to ensure protection of USCWs, including requirements for detailed tracking of the CO2 plume and any pressure associated with the injection underground, requirements for operators to demonstrate that they have the financial means to address project needs, for example, for monitoring and plugging the well at the end of its use. And also as part of the requirements, Class 6 operators must develop and maintain a series of what we call project plans that must be specific to the project site and approved by EPA. These cover things like CO2 plume tracking, testing and monitoring procedures, well construction and plugging, and emergency and remedial response planning as well. And those should be updated throughout the life of the project as needed. Now let's take a closer look at enhanced recovery and Class 2 regulations. Per EPA's regulations, Class 2 wells are used only to inject fluids associated with oil and gas production. Class 2 fluids are primarily brines or salt water, but may include CO2 as well. Class 2 enhanced recovery wells are used to inject fluids into oil-bearing formations to recover residual oil and natural gas. So same definition, but I just wanted to highlight what the regs say. There's approximately 180,000 Class 2 wells in operation, and 80% of these, or about 140 plus thousand of these, are enhanced recovery wells. Class 2 enhanced recovery wells also require a UIC permit to operate in the US, same as Class 6. These regulations were designed to protect underground sources of drinking water from, again, the risks associated with Class 2 operations. So they are different than Class 6. Protective aspects of Class 2 regulations include construction, operating, monitoring, and reporting requirements for that operation, the risks of endangerment to USDWs for enhanced recovery projects, as I mentioned, are not the same as injecting CO2 for geologic sequestration, largely due to the fact that geologic sequestration would not, without recovery, would not have the pressure management associated with oil and gas production. For that reason, they have different requirements. The regulations do speak to transitioning from Class 2 enhanced recovery CO2 injection to Class 6 CO2 injection for geologic sequestration. Those can be found at 40 CFR 144.19, and I'm always happy to talk more about our regulations and answer questions on that. So I mentioned earlier that states can obtain UIC primacy. So what is that and how does it work? So a state, territory, or tribe with UIC primary enforcement responsibility, or primacy as we commonly call it, oversees the EPA-approved UIC program in that state, territory, or tribe. EPA developed UIC program requirements. They're designed in a way to be adopted by states, territories, and tribes. The primacy programs are established under the Safe Drinking Water Act sections 1422 and 1425. So a state, tribe, or territory will take one of these two paths depending on or a combination of the two, depending on their goals and needs for their program. Section 1422 applies to all well classes and requires primacy applicants to meet EPA's minimum requirements for UIC programs. And Section 1425 applies to Class 2 wells only and requires primacy applicants to demonstrate that their standards are effective in preventing endangerment of USDWs. Both require the state, tribe, or territory to demonstrate that to the EPA that their program will have jurisdiction over underground injection in the necessary administrative, civil, and criminal enforcement penalty remedies. An EPA rulemaking is required to approve a primacy program, and once a primacy program is established, EPA still retains an oversight role over that program. If you'd like to better understand which agencies are responsible for permitting UIC wells in each state, territory, and tribe, EPA has on its website an interactive map showing all the different primacy programs across the country. So a screenshot of that map is shown here. With this, the public can view which states have primacy. You can hover over it and it'll show you more detailed information for that state, tribe, or territory, as well as it'll include the name of the agency that is responsible for permitting each of the well classes. And the map is broken up into our 10 EPA regions here. And again, where a state, tribe, or territory does not have primacy, EPA is responsible for implementing the UIC program directly. And where EPA has DI authority, the map will also identify the appropriate UIC regional office that is going to be responsible for processing the UIC permit decisions in that location. And for Class 6 specifically, only 6 states currently have approved Class 6 programs. I have them listed on this slide here along with the dates that those programs became effective: Arizona, Louisiana, North Dakota, Texas, West Virginia, and Wyoming. 7 additional states are currently working with EPA on developing their Class 6 primacy applications. Those are Alabama, Alaska, Mississippi, Nebraska, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Utah. And 1 state, Colorado, is in the proposed rulemaking phase for a Class 6 program. And I have on this slide a screenshot of the UIC primacy webpage on EPA's website, where the public can track a state as it moves through the primacy process. Several other states have indicated their interest in applying for Class 6, but those are not listed here due to the early stages of those discussions. And then currently 47 states, tribes, and territories have Class 2 primacy. There's no pending Class 6 primacy applications with EPA at this time, but one state, West Virginia, is working with EPA to revise their Class 1 through 5 primacy program. So you'll see that on the website. That's a program revision. Then if you'd like to learn more about EPA's UIC program after today's webinar, I encourage you to visit the EPA's website. The website provides a lot of background information and helpful resources about the UIC program, about primacy, each of the well classes, regulatory requirements. It includes EPA technical guidance documents as well. And then specifically for Class 6, we have a lot of tracking information for pending permit applications with the agency and application materials that are posted for the public to view. And then with that, I thank you for your time, and I'll stop there and happy to take questions with my fellow presenters.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. Really appreciate you joining us and providing this overview of the rigorous standards that projects need to go through to protect underground sources of drinking water and ensure that storage and EOR processes are done in a safe manner. So really appreciate you joining us. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of the program today. This is going to be moderated by a former colleague of mine, Emmanuel Taylor, who's a fantastic moderator, and I know he's been taking some notes in the background and combining some questions and kind of figuring out who he's going to ask. For our speakers, if you haven't already, I suggest just taking a quick look at the Q&A to kind of get an idea of what's coming down the pipeline. And Sue, I've seen you've answered a couple of them in the Q&A box as well. So thank you for doing that. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Emmanuel to go ahead and moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Alex. And no introduction would be complete without a pipeline pun. So thank you for that. And thanks everyone for being with us. I want to thank all the folks who have joined today and for the questions. Some have been submitted in advance during the registration, and others are coming in during the Q&A. I will offer as well, I know we only have limited time. We're going to try to address as many questions and topics as we can. If you do have follow-up questions that come up, please feel free to continue to enter them into the Q&A module, even as we jump into our conversation. We've received questions in a number of different categories, so I do want to try to cover as many of the topics as possible. I want to start with a question on the ADM incident in 2024. And so there was a question here about the impact of that incident on the credibility of CO2 injection. And so I think for context, for those who may not be familiar with it, I want to ask if someone, perhaps Sue or others, would be able to help us to better understand what exactly happened during that migration incident and the impact that that's had on CO2 injection more generally.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I was typing an answer for it, so I'll just phrasing it succinctly. So ADM was an early project, and they'd cloned it for the second ADM, and they designed a very ambitious, research-oriented well that they could measure everything that we researchers and the public wanted to know. And after some years, it had many zones open. After some years, the zones connected themselves together without permission. We don't have exactly the details, but they had installed apparatus to separate the zones, and they got jammed up and allowed one zone to communicate to another, which wasn't allowed in their permit. Now, all these zones are at depths of about a mile. They're injecting at 8,000 feet, and the fluids came up to 5,000 feet or thereabouts. So none of them were hazardous, but they weren't allowed. They weren't in their permit. So they got a speeding ticket from EPA. They didn't crash. This is important. And many people are acting as if what happened was they had a catastrophe. No, it's a speeding ticket that they did something and it it wasn't inside of their permit, so they got to take it. It occurred because they had a specialized, very ambitious research design, which wouldn't be applied in a commercial project. And so you shouldn't try to know everything about everything in a single well. You should target your information collection to what you really need to know to make sure the project is safe. And that's what future projects will do. It wasn't catastrophic. It was problematic because they did something they weren't allowed to do. But it wasn't intrinsically harmful. It was just not allowed, which is significant. And it's easy not to do it again.
So I'm curious.
Don't
So just
easy to avoid. It's just don't be so incredibly fancy. Keep it
So
simple.
I do want to, just as a quick follow-up, so 2024 is still pretty recent history, but I'm wondering if the incident has impacted any changes in terms of industry best practices or differences between what happens in a commercial setting versus an R&D setting, or regulations or policy. Has anything changed as a result?
A lot of conversation. I don't think any commercial projects were going to duplicate those very fancy completions. A completion is how you put the well together, how many holes you make in it, and how you connect them together to get information out of it and fluids in and out of it. Important to say is a monitoring well. So we should be careful about where we drill holes. This is commercial operators have been saying, yeah, we don't want to put. Sometimes residents say, well, I want to know everything about everything everywhere. I want a well at my house so I can see what's happening. And a commercial operator will say, no, let's not do that, because if we stick holes in them everywhere, then we have to manage those holes correctly. So we have to be selective about what we want to know so that we don't create more problem through it sounds like a physics problem, about Schrodinger's cats trying to measure things, trying to measure everything. You have to measure enough to make sure the project is safe. But they didn't need all that data from all those zones, and no commercial project would propose it. And especially anyone who asked would say, no, this is too complicated. Let's make our monitoring more focused, more specific. There was a discussion about well materials, and that's still ongoing. As Molly said, that was one of the class 6 rules. All underground injection has to show compatibility, and the EPA's rule has strict requirements for showing compatibility, and that compatibility rule is already in there. And what we saw at ADM was some incompatibility under a end member, long time sitting in the soup. Chrome steel doesn't rust, but it can get damaged, and so we have to know that any place that the well material testing that EPA requires, that ADM was doing, is necessary to make sure the materials are holding up in the environment that they're subjected to.
Yeah,
It's
so
routine
definitely
business. Routine business needs to be done routinely, and in fact, they were doing routine business. They reported themselves after the incident occurred. It wasn't like an emergency and whistles blew. It was they went in and they said, "Oh, rats, this isn't working right." Then they had to go back and fix it. So the system worked. I mean, you don't want to test a system by collecting a speeding ticket, but it works. They got
Absolutely.
their speeding
So
ticket. We all know their
yeah,
EPA is watching. You're not allowed to do this. Don't do it.
absolutely. Yeah. So we have to move on to the next topic. Thank you. Matt, I have just a few questions that came in related to the anthropogenic versus natural sources of CO2. I know you showed some diagrams that showed some of the different sources as well as utilization at different rates for both types. And there were a few follow-up questions that came in. I wanted to simply ask two things, if you could help us to better understand. Based on sort of the relative use of natural versus anthropogenic CO2, is it fair or accurate to say that the use of EOR actually makes for a lower carbon intensity end product? And then the second question that we can come back to, would be the economics. How do the economics differ between the use of natural versus anthropogenic CO2? So let's take a shot at those, and if we miss anything, I'll remind you.
Yeah, sure thing.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Manuel. Yeah, that's absolutely the first case when talking about CO2 utilization, and the CO2 has to be coming from anthropogenic sources that otherwise would be vented to the atmosphere. Absolutely, CO2 EOR got started mostly with natural CO2. I don't think any new natural sources of CO2 will ever be brought online for EOR, and the natural sources we have now are depleting. My rough estimate is another few decades of use there, with maybe some lower rates over the next few years. But certainly, we want as many anthropogenic sources coming online. We want that ratio to increase. So. The second to economics, and I think I saw a note on 45Q. To date, most CO2 EOR projects were designed without any credits in mind, and actually, building into the cost models a price of CO2 equal to what we use as a rule of thumb is about 2% of the oil price per MCF. So 25, $30 a ton that these projects would be paying for CO2. So 45Q is not a hard and fast requirement for EOR. Certainly, oil price and competition for capital in the market and many other things go into the development of a CO2 EOR project. And that's a lot of what I'm looking at now is why are more projects not getting off the ground and not being developed? And there's a lot that goes into it, but I think some of the economic comparisons of CO2 EOR versus a straight CCS project, and the given investment requirements and the long-term revenues, ultimately may show that CO2 EOR is actually as good of, if not a better investment for CO2 storage, if that's the goal. So yeah, definitely anthropogenic CO2 is we want all the capture coming into EOR.
Okay, so I want to just to be clear, I think some things that I heard. So it sounded like you said that many of the CO2 injection projects were either begun or priced or approved before the 45Q credits, and so a lot of them may not have been dependent on the credit in order for their financing to be improved. And it sounds like you've also said that there are many other important factors or factors that may be more important economically when it comes to being able to price or approve these projects, and that you see a potential value proposition in EOR as a way to help to make sure that these projects see financial approval or longevity. So I want to make sure that I was capturing that well, or if that accurately reflected what you were attempting to convey here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. I want to try to be as clear as possible so we can track which questions we are addressing and the ones that are still outstanding. So appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Molly, we do have a few questions that have come in just related to permitting. And I think folks are sort of noting the connection between EOR and CO2 injection. And from what I'm seeing, there's a desire to be clear on the boundaries between the two and when it is that the two are related as well. And so the first question is whether or not there have been any CO2 EOR projects that have been permitted under a Class 6 well as opposed to a Class 2 well. So is that something that you're able to clarify for us?
Yes, to date, or at least from what EPA has permitted. So I do want to highlight some of the states have Class 6 primacy, and I can speak to what I know about them, but I can certainly speak to the EPA permits. To date, all of the EPA Class 6 permits have been not related to EOR that we've issued so far. So they haven't been projects transitioning, I should say they haven't been projects transitioning from EOR CO2 injection to straight storage under Class 6.
Got it. And over the lifetime of a EOR project, as extraction dies down, if somebody wanted to then use that well for storage, is there challenge, are there any challenges associated with transitioning from one permit type to another?
Yeah, I can speak to that question from like the regulatory perspective. Our regulations speak to a number of factors that need to be considered when determining when that transition needs to happen. So as a regulator, we look at two things. We look at what is the primary purpose of the operation, and then what are the risks to underground sources of drinking water. And again, there's not a line in the sand to define that per our regulations. It speaks to the factors that need to be evaluated. So with that, I think I would advise operators to, if you have questions on that, it's important to go to your permitting authority early in the process if you have questions, whether that be a primacy state or EPA. We would want to speak to the Class 6 program in that regard, and the Class 2 program would also be involved in that as well, just making that decision.
Great. Thank you. Definitely appreciate that. That's helpful. We had a couple questions that have come in attempting to understand the impacts on CCUS technology, just given the current state of the political climate in the US. And so there were a few questions. We're going to try to tackle as many as we can. And so the first is just generally the impacts of the current administration. Also, understanding some impacts to the EPA in the last year. And folks are curious to know what these changes mean for the CCUS industry. So we'd love to get insight from as many of you who would like to comment on this.
I can first touch on just what we're currently focusing on in our program at this time in this year. We're working to identify ways to streamline the permitting process, and we're also focusing on working with states so they're able to implement the program. So coming in for Class 6 primacy. So that's currently the goals.
Appreciate that, Molly. I'd say perhaps as a follow-up to folks are curious to know what the industry is doing to help to move things forward. Matt, you've talked about EOR in particular and how you see this as a avenue for advancing CO2 storage. Anything else that you'd like to add in that regard?
Yeah, I think, just comparing the development of an EOR project to a CCS project, permitting can take a lot longer for Class 6, just by definition. Class 2 it can be a much shorter time frame, and the development of an EOR field can happen incrementally. And so EOR may be an option for storing CO2 a little bit faster compared to Class 6 in some cases. I think there's a lot that the industry can focus on in terms of kind of helping that along and favoring EOR versus some other maybe unconventional or other oil production methods. But there are some options that the industry can choose for EOR development. So
Absolutely. Alex, see your hand, please.
Yeah, just going back to the previous question about things that we're seeing from the administration, USEA works pretty closely with the U.S. Department of Energy, particularly the Hydrocarbons and Geothermal Energy Office. And I think it's kind of a misconception that the administration is opposed to CCUS. From what we're seeing and hearing, the administration is certainly interested and supportive of the U in CCUS, so the utilization, turning CO2 into a commodity, and obviously the enhanced oil recovery and enhanced gas recovery aspects of CCUS. So I wouldn't characterize the administration as being opposed to CCUS. I think the focus has shifted from the previous administration.
I think that clarification is helpful. Thank you. Appreciate it, Alex. Okay, we do have a few more questions. We're going to try to see if we can answer as many as possible in the time that we have remaining. So the next question, Sue, you talked about sort of the 100-year history that we have with injection generally, 50-year history with CO2 in particular. You showed some results related to migration and containment. There's a question that came in about the confidence that we have on geological timescales as opposed to maybe some of the timescales associated with the research history that you presented. So I'm curious about, what gives you confidence and the evidence that you point to.
We have two lines of evidence. For one thing, we know about fluids, including CO2, oil, and gas, other things that are buoyant and would come out if they could. So oil floats on water. So it's trying to come out, but the geologic system keeps it from coming out. And it keeps it from coming out for millions of years. Oil, gas. There's a lot of natural CO2 accumulations in the Colorado and the North Sea. Indonesia, there's, the CO2 where it's generated is also trapped for geologic periods of time. So we have direct evidence that the geosystem can retain CO2 and other fluids permanently. We also have the scientific approaches, which means that, of course, we can't observe directly for millions of years, or many other types of things, if you want to know what's your impact on your health of doing something this week. So we make tests of the same sort of extrapolations where you have someone do an exercise program and then you say, will this help you stay fit until you're very old? And that's what we want for our CO2 projects. So we do all kinds of experiments like the one I showed. And then we use models to extrapolate. And scientists always argue because models are models. We like the statement of Box saying, no model is correct, but some are useful. So we always suspicious about models, but we have had decades of many modelers looking at this, and very strong concurrence that what we see in nature is replicated in the lab. We're confident in what we're doing. The fluids will stay down. I love to talk about this.
Fantastic. Yeah. So it sounds like we have other geological examples that we can draw from and understanding natural systems. We have our own experimentation. We have models, and the experimentation and models give us some confidence about what we've already seen in natural systems. Would that be a good summary? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. So we had a few follow-up questions I want to try to address. So one was related to those again the natural versus anthropogenic sources of CO2. There were questions about the importance of purity regarding CO2 that's used for EOR. And so the question is, is purity important? And if so or if not, are there alternative, maybe perhaps less pure and less expensive sources of CO2 that could be used that may not compete with the level of purity that's required when CO2 is used in other industrial processes?
Yeah, thanks, Emmanuel. Yeah, it's an important question. Purity does matter. The definition of purity matters. CO2 coming from capture technology, and there are grades of capture technology that provide different CO2 purity streams. But in general, we're talking 95, 96% pure CO2 for EOR. It depends on what the other impurities might be, like nitrogen, methane, water are not good for injection. They reduce the effectiveness of miscibility. And capture varies based on the kind of technology that CO2 is being captured from. Ethanol, ammonia, nitrogen facilities, they generally have a pretty clean CO2 stream coming from the emissions. So it's kind of the low-hanging fruit that they say. And that's why we have those facilities contributing CO2 for EOR right now. Power is a little more difficult. Cement is a little more difficult. And so I think in terms of low purity CO2, I think right now we kind of have to focus on large scale industrial capture for CO2 for EOR. But I would say, there's a big difference in 96% and 99.9% purity of CO2. There's a lot of energy that goes into that last couple percent for purification. So there's a significant volume of CO2 that can be captured from industrial sources right now. That, if they built the plant tomorrow, it'd be ready for CO2 EOR. So
very good to know. So it sounds like um, EOR does have sensitivity to certain types of contaminants, and so a certain level of purity is needed. But in achieving that 96 versus say 99.9, there is some energy savings in being able to use something at 96 versus 99.
yeah.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I think that's helpful. There's a question about data accessibility. And so for, folks who are trying to better understand and better track the projects that are happening related to CO2 injection or EOR, curious to know if there are publicly accessible data sets that provide more information on location, permeability, total injected CO2, and other factors that may be of interest. So what can we say about the availability of data for the public access?
I wasn't going to plug myself, but since you asked, we do conduct an EOR survey of all the active CO2 EOR projects in the US every year, and this is collaborative with folks in the industry, and it's not a profitable thing for us. We provide it as kind of a public service, really just because the Oil and Gas Journal ceased their EOR survey that they used to do up until 2014. So that is available on our website. We still need to post the most recent survey findings, but I can provide a link there. And then if that's not, if there are other questions, happy to help run anything down that people want to know. So
thank you for that. Molly, please.
Yeah, and I'd like to highlight some of our Classics resources that we have on EPA's website. So we have the Classics permit tracker, which as soon as an application comes in and it's deemed complete, we post information about that application on our tracker, and it includes projected timelines for how that application is expected to move through the permitting process. We have linked to that tracker our data repository, and periodically that data repository is updated with application information as well as reporting data that comes in for class 6 projects. And so that's all available for the public to download. Confidential business information is not on that website, but anything publicly available, certainly the public can access it that way. So I am going to plug one of our tools and encourage folks to check it out.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Molly, do have a follow-up question here as well. So you talked a bit about primacy on the state level. There's a question here that's particular to Colorado, and noting its public comment phase that's currently open, and asking about the status of the primacy application or any details related to that. Is there anything that you're able to share?
I would like to clarify, yes. So how when we talk about the proposed rulemaking phase on our website, it doesn't necessarily mean that the application is out for public comment. So how our primacy process works is the first step is there's pre-application engagement with the state, then a state officially applies with all of their signed documents that they officially are seeking primacy for a well class. Once an applicant applies, that's when it moves into the proposed rulemaking phase. That's when EPA does its upfront work to make a proposed rule to make a decision on the application. Once the proposed rule is issued, that's when the public comment period would start. So we haven't reached that stage for Colorado yet. And then once the public comment period closes, that's when EPA would evaluate those public comments and issue a final rulemaking with a decision on that primacy package.
Yeah, I think that clarification is helpful. Definitely appreciate that. Okay, we have maybe just about a minute left. We have a few questions. We will try to get one of these quick follow-up questions. So there's a question about CCS, especially in the Gulf Coast region, and the corrosive nature of salt water and its relationship to isolation and containment. So I was wondering if that's a question that we could maybe quickly try to address in the time we have remaining.
People who build wells deal with corrosion as a business. no well lasts forever. So the regulators, state and federal, require regular mechanical integrity tests that show that, yep, it's still holding it, the well is still pasted together correctly. Also coupons or flow loops that test if your materials are compatible with your injectate in the system. So the questioner is right. Wells are engineered features. They fight with their environment, and the operator has to stay on top of it. But we have a lot of experience, and uh, uh, this is not a specifically hard. CO2 is not a particularly hard one. It's CO2 itself it's not a problem. It's a full of water in the system causes the trouble. So if we can, so we have a lot of tools. You can go to any trade show and they'll sell you all kinds of materials and inhibitors and programs and test programs and stuff to deal with corrosion. So like bridges, stay on top of it.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Sue. All right, I think we are just at time now. I do want to be respectful of the time of all of our attendees and our panelists as well. So I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the participation by everyone who joined, and thank you again to our speakers for taking the time to be here and to share with us. And so thanks you so much. And Alex, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Emmanuel. There was one last question that I just wanted to touch on that discusses kind of the EU's low carbon tax and why the US should engage in CCUS given kind of changing priorities of the nation. But I just wanted to kind of emphasize some of the points made earlier. Utilization and EOR makes American oil and gas products more competitive on the international stage in areas such as the EU with their CBAM or carbon border adjustment mechanism. So if you're an oil and gas producer trying to sell into the EU, it may benefit you to utilize EOR in your operations. That'll lower the carbon intensity of your product, so you're able to market your product into that geographic area, and particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think you've seen an increase in demand of energy products from the US, where they were previously getting them from Russia. So just wanted to make a quick note on that. But as you said, thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who attended. As I mentioned, this is the third part in our CCUS Demystified series. We're aiming to have our final session first week of February, looking at the status of CCUS in Louisiana. Our president and CEO, Mark Menzies, is a native of Louisiana, so we're going to have him on providing his thoughts on the topic there. So keep an eye out for that announcement. For those who are in the DC area, we hope you're able to join us tomorrow at our State of the Energy Industry Forum. And with that, thank you so much. Appreciate everyone taking the time, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks again, everyone.